The DNA is telling us. Doing the Y chromosome work, I found that there wasn't a link between Richard III and the male line relatives who are alive today.
For over 500 years, a mystery lingered in the heart of England. The story of King Richard III, the last Plantagenet king, the man whose reign was brief but whose legacy would echo through centuries, ended violently on the battlefield in 1485. And yet, even as historians retold his life and Shakespeare immortalized him in verse, one haunting question refused to die. Where was Richard's body? The chronicles of the late 15th century painted a grim picture. Richard had fallen at the Battle of Bosworth, cut down amid chaos as Henry Tudor's forces closed in. He was the last English king to die in battle, a symbol of the bloody conflict known as the Wars of the Roses. Defeated, dishonored, his crown famously plucked from the battlefield and placed on the head of Henry Tudor, Richard's broken body was said to have been carried to the nearby town of Leicester. There, according to written accounts, he was buried quickly and without ceremony in the Greyfriars Priory, a Franciscan friary at the edge of the town. But history is rarely so straightforward. The centuries that followed blurred fact and rumor. The priory itself was dissolved under Henry VIII, its buildings destroyed in the waves of religious upheaval that swept across England during the Reformation. The exact location of the friary slipped from memory. Streets were built, houses rose, and Leicester grew over its forgotten past. By the 17th century, whispers spread that Richard's bones had been dug up and cast into the River Soar, as if to erase all trace of him. Others suggested his grave had been destroyed during construction. Some even claimed his skull had been kept as a curiosity. For generations, it was widely accepted that Richard III's final resting place was lost forever, swallowed by time. This mystery gave rise to one of the great legends of English history. Here was a king demonized by chroniclers loyal to the Tudors, immortalized by Shakespeare as a hunchbacked villain, and condemned by rumor to eternal obscurity. A man whose remains seemed destined never to be found, until a discovery in the unlikeliest of places would turn the story upside down. Fast forward to 2012. On the surface, it seemed impossible. Beneath an ordinary council car park in Leicester, a place of faded white lines, oil stains, and parked cars, archaeologists were preparing for a dig. Years of meticulous research had suggested that this very spot lay atop the forgotten site of the Greyfriars Priory. For the dedicated historians and archaeologists who had pursued the trail, this was a chance to resolve centuries of speculation. For skeptics, it seemed fanciful. How could the bones of a medieval king survive beneath modern concrete? Yet within just days of beginning their excavation, the team uncovered something extraordinary. In what was once believed to be the choir of the friary, the place where Richard was said to have been buried, they unearthed a skeleton. This skeleton, at first simply labeled Skeleton 1, carried striking clues that hinted at its importance. The bones belonged to a man in his early 30s, the same age Richard had been at his death. The skeleton showed horrific battle wounds, deep cuts to the skull consistent with sword and halberd strikes, evidence that his helmet had likely been torn away in his final moments. These brutal injuries matched the historical accounts of Richard's violent end. And then, there was the spine. The skeleton revealed severe scoliosis, a sideways curvature that would have raised one shoulder higher than the other. Contemporary chroniclers had spoken of Richard's uneven shoulders. Shakespeare, dramatizing him a century later, exaggerated this into the enduring image of a deformed hunchback. But here, at last, was the truth. Richard III was not the monstrous figure of legend, yet he had lived with a serious spinal condition that marked his appearance and may have shaped his reputation. The weight of evidence was overwhelming. Carbon dating confirmed the remains dated to the late 15th century, the very time of Richard's death. Isotope analysis of the teeth revealed a diet rich in meat and fish, consistent with someone of noble rank. The burial site matched the historical records of Greyfriars. It was astonishing. Against all odds, the long-lost king had seemingly been found. But archaeology alone could not settle the matter. Skeptics demanded proof, evidence stronger than circumstantial matches. To confirm beyond doubt that this was Richard III, science would have to do what history could not. The key would be hidden in the fragile fragments of DNA that had lain in the earth for more than 500 years. The discovery of a skeleton beneath a Leicester car park was already one of the most extraordinary archaeological finds of the century. But if the world was to accept that these were indeed the remains of King Richard III, archaeology alone would not be enough. Broken bones, battle wounds, and a curved spine made for compelling evidence. Yet in the world of science, compelling is not the same as conclusive. The real test would come not from spades and trowels, but from microscopes and genetic sequencing. The question was deceptively simple. Could DNA extracted from bones buried for more than 500 years prove, beyond any doubt, that this was Richard III? This challenge was unlike anything historians of the past could have imagined. In the 15th century, identity was confirmed by heraldry, written records, or eyewitness testimony. But in the 21st century, scientists could turn to the code of life itself. DNA, our genetic fingerprint, offered the potential for certainty that no medieval chronicler could ever provide. Yet the obstacles were immense. Ancient DNA is notoriously fragile. Over centuries, it fragments into tiny pieces, often contaminated by soil, bacteria, or even the touch of modern humans during excavation. To make matters worse, most of our genetic material is shuffled and mixed with every generation, making it difficult to trace across long spans of time. But two special forms of DNA hold remarkable stability across centuries: mitochondrial DNA and the Y chromosome. Mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA, is passed down from mother to child. It changes very little over generations, meaning that all descendants of the same maternal line share nearly identical mtDNA. This provided the first clear path forward. Richard III himself had no surviving children, but his siblings did. His mother, Cecily Neville, had borne many children, and through his sisters, living descendants could be traced even into the modern day. After years of careful genealogical research, scientists identified two people whose maternal ancestry stretched directly back to Cecily Neville: Michael Ibsen, a furniture maker in London, and Wendy Doldig, a genealogist living in Canada. If the mitochondrial DNA from the Leicester skeleton matched theirs, it would serve as powerful evidence that these were indeed the bones of Richard III. The second line of investigation was the paternal one. Unlike mitochondrial DNA, which passes from mothers to all their children, the Y chromosome is passed from father to son. In theory, Richard's Y chromosome should match that of other living male line descendants of the wider Plantagenet family. Researchers turned to descendants of Edward III, Richard's ancestor. The Somerset family, descendants of Henry Somerset, the 5th Duke of Beaufort, were chosen as the reference line. The logic was straightforward. If the skeleton's Y chromosome matched that of the Somersets, it would strongly confirm Richard's identity and his unbroken place in the Plantagenet bloodline. But science is rarely so straightforward. Extracting DNA from Richard's remains required extreme caution. In specialized clean rooms, scientists donned protective suits, masks, and gloves. They drilled into the teeth and dense bones, areas most likely to preserve DNA, and painstakingly recovered tiny fragments of genetic material. These fragments were then replicated millions of times by powerful machines, slowly reconstructing the genetic code like piecing together a shredded manuscript. Every step was checked, rechecked, and monitored to prevent contamination. When the results came back, the first test, mitochondrial DNA, was stunning. The code from the skeleton matched perfectly with both Michael Ibsen and Wendy Doldig. The odds of such a match occurring by chance were vanishingly small, in the range of 1 in millions. To many, this was the smoking gun. The remains beneath the car park were, without doubt, those of Richard III. But then came the second test, the Y chromosome. And with it, a discovery that shook the foundations of English royal history. The skeleton's Y chromosome did not match the Somersets. Instead of a perfect confirmation, scientists found a genetic break in the paternal line. Somewhere in the long chain of fathers and sons stretching from Edward III to the present, a recorded father was not the biological father. In scientific terms, this is known as a false paternity event, a polite phrase for what history would call illegitimacy. The implications were explosive. Did this mean Richard himself was illegitimate, not truly a Plantagenet by blood? If so, what did that mean for his claim to the throne in 1483? Or was the break in the bloodline elsewhere, perhaps in the Somerset line, meaning that the noble family who traced their descent with pride might not truly be connected by blood to Edward III? The truth was murky. With so many centuries separating Edward III from the present, the exact moment of illegitimacy could not be identified without testing the remains of other royals. What was certain, however, was that the supposedly sacred, unbroken bloodline of kings was not as unbroken as history had long assumed. For historians, the mitochondrial DNA was enough to confirm beyond doubt that the skeleton was Richard III. But for the public, it was the Y chromosome result that captured the imagination. Here was a discovery that reached far beyond one man's grave. It touched on questions of dynasty, legitimacy, and the very idea of monarchy itself. For centuries, kings and queens had claimed their right to rule through blood, a direct, unbroken line from ancestors long dead. Now, science revealed that this bloodline was more fragile, more human, and more vulnerable to scandal than anyone had believed. Was the English monarchy built upon a chain of succession that included hidden illegitimacies? Could entire dynasties have ruled not by divine right, but by accident of secrecy? These were not just academic questions. They were challenges to centuries of national identity. And yet, as controversial as these findings were, they also brought Richard III closer to us. No longer just a caricature in Shakespeare's plays or a shadowy villain in Tudor propaganda. He emerged as a man, flawed, wounded, perhaps misjudged, and finally rediscovered. When archaeologists first uncovered Richard III's remains beneath the Leicester car park, they could hardly have imagined the storm that would follow. The scientific evidence was overwhelming. This was Richard III, the last Plantagenet king of England. But now, another question loomed large. What should be done with him? For more than 5 centuries, Richard had lain in obscurity, forgotten under layers of history. His body had been lost, his reputation maligned, his name blackened by Tudor propaganda, and Shakespeare's enduring portrayal of him as a villainous tyrant. But now that he had been found, he could not simply remain a scientific specimen. He was a king of England. And kings, even centuries later, demanded dignity. The discovery set off a heated debate. Leicester, the city where his remains had been unearthed, argued that he should be reburied in Leicester Cathedral, only steps away from where he was originally laid to rest. York, however, the city Richard had long favored, where he had strong ties and had planned to establish his northern power base, insisted that he belonged there. For months, the debate raged. Petitions gathered thousands of signatures. Academics, politicians, and members of the public all weighed in, some with passion, others with outrage. To many in York, Leicester was simply the place of Richard's humiliation, where his body had been displayed after Bosworth, where he had been buried hastily without ceremony. York, by contrast, was the place Richard had loved. He had visited often, supported the city, and was admired by many of its citizens. To them, Richard was their king, and it was only right he should return home. Leicester, however, had the law on its side. The excavation had been carried out with a license, specifying that any remains discovered would be reburied locally. After a long legal battle, the courts ruled in favor of Leicester. Richard III would be reinterred in Leicester Cathedral. This decision sparked controversy, but it also set the stage for one of the most extraordinary royal ceremonies of modern times. In March 2015, more than 500 years after his death, Richard III was given a funeral fit for a king. His remains, placed in a beautifully crafted oak coffin, were transported in a solemn procession through the towns and villages connected with his final journey. Tens of thousands of people lined the streets. Some carried white roses, the symbol of the House of York. Others waved banners of the Plantagenet line. For many, it was a moment of history come alive, a bridge across half a millennium. The coffin was received at Leicester Cathedral with full ceremony. Clergy, historians, descendants, and even members of the royal family attended. The Archbishop of Canterbury presided over the service, formally laying Richard to rest in a tomb of polished Swaledale stone, inscribed with his name, Richard III, King of England, 1452 to 1485. For the first time in centuries, Richard had a marked grave. No longer lost, no longer forgotten, he was restored to dignity. But beyond the ceremony, the discovery of Richard III's remains left a legacy that went far deeper. It reshaped how historians viewed him, not as the monstrous villain painted by Shakespeare, but as a far more complex figure. The curved spine revealed a man who lived with scoliosis, but not the grotesque hunchback of legend. The battle wounds told of a brutal death in the thick of combat, not a coward fleeing the field. The DNA testing revealed the fragility of dynastic claims and shattered the myth of unbroken royal bloodlines. In a sense, Richard III became more human. Not a symbol of tyranny, nor merely a victim of Tudor propaganda, but a man caught in the violent politics of his age. A king who fought bravely, who lived with a debilitating condition, who ruled for just over 2 years, and whose fate reflected the ruthless nature of medieval power. The discovery also reminded us of the power of archaeology. Beneath the most ordinary places, in this case, a council car park, lies the possibility of rewriting history. What had long been assumed lost forever was suddenly, miraculously, found. It was a story that captivated not only historians, but millions of ordinary people around the world. Even today, the debates continue. Was Richard truly the usurper and murderer his enemies claimed, responsible for the disappearance of the princes in the tower? Or was he a more capable and pragmatic ruler, cut down too soon to secure his reforms? The truth may never be fully known, but thanks to the work of archaeologists and scientists, we now have something that seemed impossible only a decade ago. His body, his face, reconstructed through forensic science, and a clearer picture of the man behind the myth. Perhaps the greatest irony of all is this. Richard III, who was denied dignity in death, who was vilified for centuries, has in the 21st century found something like redemption. His reburial was not only a historical event, but also a cultural moment. An acknowledgement that even kings deserve fairness, that history is not fixed, and that truth can be rediscovered even after 500 years. In the end, the discovery of Richard III's remains forced us to confront not only the mysteries of one man's life, but also the fragility of monarchy itself. For if DNA can reveal breaks in the bloodline of kings, then the foundations of royal legitimacy are not divine or eternal, but human, subject to the same uncertainties, secrets, and scandals that shape every family tree. And yet, there lies the true power of this story. It is not only about kings and crowns, but about the passage of time, the endurance of memory, and the way truth, however buried, has a way of resurfacing. Richard III was once lost to history. Now he has been found. And in finding him, we have rediscovered not only the man, but the ever-changing story of England itself.